The crack of rifle fire shattered the desert silence as Jake Morrison spurred his exhausted horse across the unforgiving Arizona Badlands. Behind him, dust clouds marked the relentless pursuit of Sheriff Bradley's posse, their shouts growing closer with each passing minute. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the barren landscape, turning the air into waves of shimmering heat that made the distant mesas dance like mirages. Jake's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as his horse stumbled on loose shale. The animal was dying beneath him, foam dripping from its mouth, sides heaving with each labored breath. 3 days of hard riding had pushed both man and beast beyond their limits. The stolen bank money in his saddlebags felt heavier than lead, a burden that might cost him his life if he didn't find shelter soon. Another gunshot rang out, this one close enough that Jake heard the bullet whistle past his ear. He glanced back to see Sheriff Bradley himself, no more than 200 yards behind, rifle raised for another shot. The lawman's face was a mask of grim determination that Jake knew all too well. Bradley had been hunting him for 2 years, ever since the Tucson job went wrong and left a deputy dead in the street. Jake's horse gave a pitiful whinny and collapsed, sending him tumbling across the rocky ground. Pain exploded through his shoulder as he hit, but adrenaline kept him moving. He grabbed his rifle and what water he could carry, leaving the money behind. It was worthless to a dead man. The sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered in his ears as he scrambled up a steep embankment toward a cluster of weathered sandstone formations. His boots slipped on loose rock, sending small avalanches cascading down behind him. Each breath burned his lungs as the thin desert air offered little relief. He reached the top just as Bradley's voice boomed across the canyon. "Morrison! There's nowhere left to run! Come down peaceful and I'll see you get a fair trial." Jake knew better. Bradley's idea of justice had always been swift and final. He pressed himself against the hot stone, feeling the sun's heat seep through his sweat-soaked shirt. From his vantage point, he could see the posse spreading out below, at least 8 men with rifles and plenty of ammunition. They had time on their side. All they had to do was wait for thirst to drive him out. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint and unexpected that at first he thought the desert heat was playing tricks on his mind. A baby's cry, weak and desperate, carried on the hot wind from somewhere among the rock formations behind him. Jake froze, straining to listen. There it was again, barely audible but unmistakably human. His weathered face creased with confusion. What would a baby be doing out here in this godforsaken wasteland? There wasn't a settlement for 50 miles in any direction. Moving as quietly as his boots would allow on the loose stone, Jake crept deeper into the maze of sandstone pillars and narrow passages. The crying grew slightly louder, guiding him through shadows that offered blessed relief from the brutal sun. He rounded a massive boulder and stopped dead in his tracks. Before him lay the remnants of what had once been a small wagon, its wooden sides splintered and scattered across a natural clearing between the rocks. Torn fabric fluttered in the breeze like prayer flags, and dark stains on the ground told a story Jake had seen too many times before. Apache war party, by the look of it, probably 3 days past based on how the blood had dried and cracked. But it was what lay in the shadow of an overturned water barrel that made his breath catch in his throat. A tiny bundle wrapped in what appeared to be deer hide, moving slightly with each weak cry. Jake approached cautiously, his rifle ready despite the impossibility of threat from something so small. As he knelt beside the bundle, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle, he carefully pulled back the hide wrapping. A pair of dark eyes, bright with fever and dehydration, stared up at him from a face no bigger than his fist. The baby couldn't be more than 2 months old, her tiny body barely filling the hide that had been her shelter from the elements. Jake had never been around children. His life had been one of saloons, robberies, and running from the law. But something about those eyes, the way they seemed to look right through him to something he'd forgotten existed, made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The child's lips were cracked and dry, her breathing shallow and rapid. She wouldn't last another hour in this heat without water. Jake looked at his canteen, knowing it contained barely enough to keep himself alive until nightfall. Every instinct screamed at him to leave the baby and save himself. One life against another, and his had at least a fighting chance. Below them, Sheriff Bradley's voice echoed off the canyon walls again. "We know you're up there, Morrison. Sun's getting high, and we've got all day. Water runs out quick in this heat." Jake stared down at the tiny face, seeing his own reflection in those fevered eyes. When had he become the kind of man who could abandon a helpless child? When had survival become more important than the last shreds of his humanity? His hands trembled slightly as he unscrewed the cap of his canteen. The baby's mouth opened instinctively at the first drop of water, her tiny tongue desperate for moisture. Jake gave her small sips, watching as some of the fever seemed to leave her eyes with each precious drop. As he cradled her against his chest, feeling her tiny heartbeat against his ribs, Jake Morrison realized his life had just changed forever. He no longer had the luxury of thinking only of himself. The baby's survival now depended entirely on him, a man who had spent the last 15 years proving he couldn't be depended on for anything. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, running from the law for taking money that wasn't his, now responsible for protecting something infinitely more valuable than any bank vault could hold. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Jake carefully tucked the baby inside his leather vest, her tiny body fitting against his chest where his heartbeat might comfort her. He could feel her breathing, still too fast but stronger than before. She would need more water soon, and food, and shelter from the brutal desert sun. All things he didn't have and couldn't provide while running for his life. The sound of boots on stone made him freeze. One of Bradley's men had found a way up into the formations and was moving through the maze of passages, getting closer with each careful step. Jake could hear the man's breathing, heavy with exertion and the excitement of the hunt. Moving with the silence that had kept him alive through countless close calls, Jake slipped deeper into the shadows between the towering rocks. The baby seemed to sense the danger, remaining perfectly still against his chest. Her trust in him was absolute and terrifying. The deputy appeared at the edge of the clearing where the wagon had been attacked, his rifle sweeping the area with practiced efficiency. Jake held his breath, knowing that one sound, one reflected glint of sunlight off his gun barrel, would bring the entire posse down on them. The lawman's eyes lingered on the scattered remains of the wagon, taking in the scene with the calculating gaze of someone who had seen too much violence. But his attention was focused on finding Jake, not on investigating an old Apache raid. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on, his boots scraping against stone as he continued his search. Jake waited until the sound of footsteps faded completely before allowing himself to breathe normally again. The baby stirred against his chest, making a small sound that could have been contentment or distress. Either way, it reminded him that their situation was far from resolved. The sun was climbing higher, turning the stone formations into a furnace that would kill them both within hours if they remained exposed. Jake's water was nearly gone, given mostly to the child whose life now hung in the balance of every decision he made. He had to find shelter, but more importantly, he had to find a way out of this trap that didn't end with both of them dead in the desert sand. As he crept through the shadows, the baby's weight against his chest a constant reminder of what was at stake, Jake Morrison began to understand that saving this child might be the first truly meaningful thing he had done in his entire misspent life. The question now was whether he would live long enough to see it through to the end. The hunt continued below, voices calling back and forth as the posse tightened their search. But something had changed in Jake's mind. The desperation was still there, but it was no longer just about his own survival. For the first time in years, he had something worth protecting, something that made the fight worthwhile. He just had to figure out how to keep them both alive long enough to matter. The desert night brought a cruel deception of relief. While the temperature dropped mercifully from the day's scorching heat, it also brought new dangers that Jake Morrison had not anticipated. The baby in his arms had grown weaker despite the water he'd shared, her breathing becoming more labored as the hours passed. Her tiny body alternated between burning fever and bone-chilling cold, and Jake found himself constantly adjusting his position to shield her from the wind that howled through the stone passages like the voices of the damned. Sheriff Bradley's men had made camp at the base of the rock formations, their fire casting dancing shadows against the canyon walls. Jake could hear their voices carried on the night air, confident and patient. They knew he was trapped somewhere above them, and they were content to wait for dawn to flush him out. What they didn't know was that he was no longer running alone. Jake pressed deeper into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders, feeling his way in the darkness with one hand while cradling the infant with the other. His boots scraped softly against loose stone, each sound making him freeze and listen for signs that he'd been heard. The baby stirred restlessly against his chest, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching as if fighting some invisible enemy. The reality of his situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Even if he managed to evade the posse, he was now responsible for a child who needed constant care, medicine he didn't have, and food he couldn't provide. His canteen was empty, drained drop by precious drop into the baby's parched mouth throughout the long day. Dehydration was already making his head pound and his vision blur at the edges. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the eastern horizon, Jake found himself in a natural shelter formed by fallen rocks. It wasn't much, but it offered protection from both the wind and prying eyes. The baby had finally fallen into what he hoped was sleep rather than unconsciousness, her breathing barely perceptible against his chest. Jake allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment, but the sound of boots on stone brought him instantly alert. The posse was moving, spreading out through the maze of formations in a systematic search that would eventually find them. He could hear Bradley's voice directing his men, calm and methodical as always. The baby chose that moment to cry, her weak voice somehow carrying through the still morning air like a gunshot. Jake pressed his hand gently over her mouth, not to silence her but to muffle the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs as he waited to see if they'd been discovered. Footsteps approached their hiding place, deliberate and careful. Jake drew his Colt with his free hand, knowing that if it came to shooting, the baby's chances of survival would drop to nothing. But he would not let them take her to die slowly in some territorial orphanage, if she was lucky enough to make it that far. The footsteps stopped just outside the shelter. Jake could hear the man's breathing, could almost feel his presence through the thin wall of rock that separated them. Time stretched like pulled taffy as predator and prey waited for the other to make the first move. Then, impossibly, the footsteps moved away. Jake remained frozen for what felt like hours before daring to breathe normally again. The baby had gone quiet, as if she too understood the gravity of their situation. Her dark eyes stared up at him with an intelligence that seemed far beyond her few weeks of life. As the sun climbed higher, turning their stone shelter into an oven, Jake made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He had to find water, not just for himself but for the child whose life had somehow become more important than his own. And that meant taking risks he would never have considered when he was running alone. He waited until the heat of midday, when he knew the posse would be seeking shade themselves, then began to move. The baby remained mercifully quiet as he navigated the treacherous terrain, her tiny body tucked securely inside his vest where his heartbeat might provide some comfort. Jake remembered seeing signs of an old stream bed during his flight the day before, marked by a line of stunted cottonwood trees that might indicate underground water. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. The journey would take him closer to the posse's position, but without water, they would both be dead within hours anyway. The descent from the rock formations proved more dangerous than the climb up had been. Loose stones cascaded down the slope with each step, creating small avalanches that could alert every lawman within miles to his position. Jake moved with painful slowness, testing each foothold before committing his weight, all while protecting the precious cargo pressed against his chest. He was halfway down when he saw them. Not Bradley's posse, but something far more dangerous and unexpected. A line of riders moving silently across the desert floor like shadows given substance. Even at a distance, Jake recognized the fluid way they moved as one with their horses, the way they seemed to flow across the landscape rather than simply traverse it. Apache warriors. At least 20 that he could count, possibly more hidden in the shimmering heat waves. They moved with purpose, following a trail that Jake couldn't see but that was apparently as clear to them as a highway. And that trail was leading them directly toward the rock formations where Bradley's men were camped. Jake pressed himself flat against the cliff face, hoping the shadows would hide him from both groups of potential enemies. The baby seemed to sense his tension and remained perfectly still, her breathing so shallow he had to look down to make sure she was still alive. The Apache riders paused at the base of the formations, their leader raising his hand in a gesture that brought the entire group to an immediate halt. Jake could see them clearly now, their faces painted for war, rifles and traditional weapons gleaming in the harsh sunlight. They had found Bradley's trail just as surely as the sheriff had found Jake's. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a landslide. Bradley's men, confident in their numbers and firepower, opened fire from their concealed positions among the rocks. The sound of gunshots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and Jake watched in horrified fascination as the Apaches scattered with practiced efficiency, using the terrain to their advantage in ways the white men couldn't match. The battle was brief but fierce. Bradley's posse had the advantage of cover and position, but the Apache had something more valuable. They were fighting on their ancestral lands, using tactics perfected over generations of warfare. Within minutes, the sound of gunfire faded, replaced by an ominous silence that spoke of death and defeat. Jake remained motionless, knowing that movement now would mean certain death. The baby stirred against his chest, making a soft sound that could have been hunger or distress. He had no food to offer her, no water to ease her thirst, nothing but his own failing body heat to keep her alive. As the sun reached its zenith, Jake heard voices below. Not the familiar drawl of Bradley's men, but something else entirely. Apache voices, speaking in their native tongue with the calm efficiency of warriors who had completed their task. The posse was either dead or scattered to the four winds, leaving Jake alone with the baby in a landscape now controlled by men who had every reason to kill him on sight. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years running from white man's justice, only to find himself trapped between the hammer and anvil of a larger conflict he had never asked to join. The baby in his arms was Apache, he realized now, studying her features in the harsh desert light. She belonged to the people who had just eliminated his pursuers, but that didn't guarantee his safety. White men who stole Apache children rarely lived to tell about it. As the afternoon wore on, Jake began to hear something that chilled his blood more than the night wind ever could. Drums. Distant at first, but growing steadily closer and more insistent. Not the drums of celebration, but of mourning. Someone was dead, someone important, and the entire desert seemed to pulse with grief and rage. The baby grew more restless as the drum beats echoed off the canyon walls, her tiny fists moving weakly as if trying to reach toward the sound. Jake realized she was responding to something he couldn't understand, some connection to her people that transcended her few weeks of life. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Jake made his way carefully down to the desert floor. The baby needed water desperately, and he could no longer provide what she needed from his own rapidly failing resources. If he was going to die, at least he could try to return her to her people first. The remains of Bradley's camp told a story of swift and decisive victory. Bodies lay scattered among overturned supplies and smoldering equipment, but Jake noticed something strange. The dead men had been arranged respectfully, their weapons placed beside them and their faces covered with scraps of cloth. This was not the aftermath of a massacre, but of warriors honoring fallen enemies. Jake found a water barrel that had somehow survived the battle, its contents still cool despite the desert heat. He gave the baby what she needed, watching as some color returned to her tiny face, then allowed himself a few precious swallows. It might be the last water either of them ever tasted. As darkness fell across the desert, the drums grew louder and more complex, joined by voices raised in songs that spoke of loss and remembrance. Jake followed the sound, knowing he was walking toward either salvation or death, but unable to see any other choice. The Apache camp appeared before him like a vision from another world. Dozens of fires burned in the gathering darkness, surrounded by more warriors than Jake had ever seen in one place. Men, women, and children moved through the firelight with purposeful grace, their faces marked by grief but not broken by it. At the center of the camp, Jake saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. An elderly chief sat beside a funeral pyre, his weathered face streaked with tears as he held what appeared to be a child's clothing to his chest. The drums beat steadily around him, and Jake realized he was witnessing something sacred and private, a moment of mourning that no white man should ever see. But the baby in his arms began to cry, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. Every conversation stopped, every head turned toward the sound, and Jake found himself the center of attention of 70 Apache warriors who had every reason to kill him where he stood. The elderly chief rose slowly to his feet, his eyes locked on Jake with an intensity that made the outlaw's knees threaten to buckle. But as the old man approached, Jake saw something in his face that he had not expected. Not rage, not hatred, but something that looked dangerously like hope. The chief stopped just an arm's length away and spoke a single word in his native tongue. Jake didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was a question, urgent and desperate, the voice of a man who had lost everything and now faced the possibility of miraculous redemption. Jake carefully withdrew the baby from his vest, holding her out toward the chief with hands that trembled from exhaustion and fear. The old man's face crumpled as he took the tiny bundle, his weathered hands impossibly gentle as he pulled back the hide wrapping to reveal the child's face. What happened next would haunt Jake Morrison for the rest of his days. The proud Apache chief fell to his knees in the desert sand, clutching the baby to his chest as tears streamed down his face. The drums stopped beating, the singing ceased, and the entire camp fell silent as their leader wept openly for the first time in living memory. When the chief finally looked up at Jake again, his eyes held a depth of gratitude that no words in any language could express. He spoke rapidly to his warriors, gesturing toward Jake with obvious respect, and the outlaw realized that his life had just taken another unexpected turn. The baby he had saved was not just any Apache child. She was the granddaughter of Chief Red Eagle, thought killed in the same raid that had destroyed her parents' wagon. Jake had unknowingly returned the most precious thing in the world to a man who had already begun mourning her loss. And now, as the drums began to beat again with a rhythm of celebration rather than grief, Jake Morrison understood that he was no longer running from anything. He was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he belonged.